Henry McAdams' life simply was living hell. Henry was 17 years old. He was a soldier in the British 1st of the 7th Riflery Battalion, and as such, one of the first men to fight in World War I. Now, Henry fought in Belgium, although he never saw much of the country, because Henry lived and he fought in a trench. Now, this particular trench was 14 foot deep and 35 miles long. If you can imagine a trench that's actually about the same depth as the height of this room, and the length would be from here all the way to Lawrence, Kansas. And Henry lived in the bottom of this trench. The British dug this trench in the spring of 1914. The earth was soft, the ground was porous, there weren't any rocks, it was easy digging. When the war started and the men filled this trench, what they soon discovered is that everything went into this trench and nothing came out. Pretty soon, the trench became something between a dump and a sewer. They used it as a latrine. Excuse me. And they actually buried their dead, sometimes several layers deep down in this trench. What the British didn't realize is that this trench, and all the trenches in Belgium, were at about sea level. Well, come fall, in October, when the rains came, and the bottoms of the trenches began to fill with water, everything that they had buried up to this point had floated to the surface. The German trenches were no better. As a matter of fact, they were close enough that if the shelling stopped and the wind was right, you could hear the Germans talking. Henry lived in this trench. He ate in this trench. He vomited and defecated and cried himself to sleep, all in this trench. And it was on Christmas Eve of 1914, and he's leaning against the dirt wall of his hellish home when he heard something unmistakable. Now, he was prone to hallucinating and daydreaming. He dreamed about home. He dreamed about England, and he dreamed about his family. He dreamed about warm beds and hot meals. But that night, on Christmas Eve, he knew he'd gone out of his mind, because what he heard was an angelic choir, a men's choir. It didn't sound human. It sounded like it came from heaven. It was absolutely perfect, except for one thing. The hymn that they were singing, the words were all wrong. Stilig Nacht, Heilig Nacht, alles schlaft, einsam wacht. Silent night, holy night, all is calm. Wait a minute. If I'm hearing this, the shelling has stopped. So Henry climbed up the side of the trench up to the firing board and stood next to the keeper of the watch. The keeper of the watch. Excuse me. The keeper of the watch was absolutely shocked, and with wide eyes, he handed Henry the binoculars. Well, if Henry couldn't believe his ears, he definitely couldn't believe his eyes. There's a tradition in Germany of the Tannenbaum, and you'll recognize it. In Germany, around 1912, 1914, on Christmas Eve, the German families would go out into the woods and cut down a young fir tree, bring it into the house and stand it up and light candles and mount them in the tree and string it with strings of popcorn. And they would spend that evening singing Christmas carols around this Tannenbaum. So powerful and so embedded into German life was this Tannenbaum that in 1914, the German High Command, the German government, sent thousands and thousands and thousands of these young sapling trees from Belgium to all of the fighting fronts of World War I, so the men of their German men could celebrate Christmas this way. as Henry stood on the firing platform, and he's looking through his binoculars. He looks past the shell craters. He looks past the barbed wire. He looks past all of the dead men that he sees in the killing field. And what he sees along with the parapet of the German trenches are Christmas trees. Not one, not 10, but thousands of Christmas trees as far as the eye can see. These Christmas trees were all lit with candles, and some had Chinese lanterns, and many of them had strings of paper. And Henry was every bit as shocked as the watchman. He jumped down into the trench and ran off to tell his buddies what he had just seen. After the 6th verse of Stille Nacht, the British had their act together and returned the favor by singing Silent Night to the Germans in English. And what commenced was a song fest that lasted all night long that Christmas Eve. The Germans would sing a hymn. The British would recognize them because almost all of these hymns came from Germany that had been translated into English. And the English would send one back and forth and back and forth. The next morning, the senior men from both sides met in no man's land and asked if they could retrieve and bury their dead. The chaplains came forward and decided that they would have one burial ceremony instead of numerous ceremonies. The Brits found wood from biscuit boxes and made crosses, not just for their men, but for all of the men. And it was determined that these fallen soldiers would be buried not on one side of no man's land or the other, but exactly right down the middle. And so, as the chaplains gave their funeral service for all of the men, they stood around in a circle of over 100 men and sang songs, sang hymns, this time together, and prayed for all of their dead. Afterward, peace broke out. Someone had a harmonica, someone else had a fiddle. They began to sing and dance. There was a German, a barber, that offered to cut all of the British men's hair. There was a famous British tenor that sang for all of the men. They shared pictures of their loved ones. Some of the Germans were dating British girls, and so they wrote letters back home to be sent back through the British lines, through the British couriers. They traded buttons on their uniforms and Christmas gifts and schnapps for rum. Someone had a soccer ball, and so a soccer game commenced. And the men stood 3 deep, cheering for either the Germans or the British. That day, the Germans won that soccer game 3-2. The soccer ball, signed by all the men that played on those soccer teams, to this day is in a museum in Dresden, Germany. At the end of the day, it was determined that they would go back to their trenches. The Germans, as soon as they were all accounted for and in their trench, would fire 3 shots to say that they were in place. The British, as soon as they were all in their trenches, all safe, all accounted for, would fire 2 shots, and the war would begin again. Interesting, the Allies and the Axis, because there were more countries involved in this than just Germany and Great Britain, but the Allies and the Axis denied that this event even took place. For many, many years, this story was nothing more than an urban legend. And it took historians many, many, many years later who collected the letters from the soldiers that they had sent back home from all sides. They compared these letters one to another and found that the stories were exact. It did happen. Not only did it happen for the men around Henry McAdams, but it happened with thousands of men along hundreds of miles of trench in World War II. This was the only time in the history of warfare that the combatants unilaterally had a truce that was not agreed upon by the leaders. It's interesting, though, that again, it's recorded that the High Command had to pull all of these men back off of the front line because the war indeed had commenced. Everybody was firing at each other, but nobody was dying because all of the men were firing over the heads of their enemy. As you might imagine, the generals were furious. And so consequently what they did was they made any fraternization with the enemy high treason. That was death by firing squad. For the next 3 Christmases of World War I, for the next 46 months, the next 3 Christmases for the week beforehand, both sides escalated the war so peace would never break out again. But for one brief moment, the men of World War I, for one brief moment, stopped the war. For one brief moment in time, man saw his fellow man not as an enemy, but loved him as a brother. For one brief moment in time, these men looked beyond their own country, beyond their own boundary lines, and saw men in a worldview. And for one brief moment in time, 98 years ago, next Monday, Henry McAdams and the men that fought in World War I put down their arms and chose peace.